Kai Lung's Golden Hours, Part 2 by Ernest Bramah. Chapter 10. The Incredible Obtuseness of Those Who Had Opposed the Virtuous Kai Lung. It was later than the appointed hour that same day when Kai Lung and Hua Mei met about the shutter, for the mandarin's importunity had disturbed the harmonious balance of their fixed arrangement. As the storyteller left the inner chamber, a message of understanding, veiled from those who stood around, had passed between their eyes, and so complete was the sympathy that now directed them that without a spoken word their plans were understood. Li Lo's acquiescence had been secured by the bestowal of a flask of wine provided already by Hua Mei against such an emergency. And though the doorkeeper had indicated reproach by a variety of sounds, he forbore from speaking openly of any vaster store. Let the bitterness of this one's message be that which is first spoken, so that the later and more enduring words of our remembrance may be devoid of sting. A star has shone across my mediocre path, which now an envious cloud has conspired to obscure. This meeting will doubtless be our last. Then replied Kai Lung from the darkness of the space above, his voice unhurried as its wont. If this is indeed the end, then to the spirits of the destinies I prostrate myself in thanks for those golden hours that have gone before, and had there been no others to recall then, would I equally account myself repaid in life and death by this. My words ascend with yours in a pale spiral to the bosom of the universal mother, Hua Mei made response. I likewise am content, having tasted this felicity. There is yet one other thing, esteemed, if such a presumption is to be endured, Kai Lung ventured to request. Each day a stone has been displaced from off the wall, and these now lie about your gentle feet. If you should inconvenience yourself to the extent of standing upon the mound thus raised, and would stretch up your hand, I, leaning forth, could touch it with my fingertips. This also will I dare to do and feel it no reproach, replied Hua Mei. Thus, for the first time their fingers met. Let me now continue the ignoble message that my unworthy lips must bear, resumed the maiden with the gesture of refined despair. Ming Shu and Shan Tian, recognizing a mutual need in each, have agreed to forego their wordy strife and have entered upon a common cause. To mark this reconciliation, the mandarin tomorrow night will make a feast of wine and song in honor of Ming Shu, and into this assembly you will be led, bound and wearing the wooden cane, to contribute to their offensive mirth. To this end you will not be arraigned tomorrow, but on the following morning at a special court, swift sentence will be passed and carried out. Neither will Shan Tian suffer any interruption nor raise an arresting hand. The darkness by this time encompassed them so that neither could see the other's face, but across the scent-laden air, Hua Mei was conscious of a subtle change, as of a poise or the tightening of a responsive cord. This is the end, she whispered up, unable to sustain. Ah, is it not the end? In the high wall of destiny that bounds our lives, there is ever a hidden gap to which the pure ones may guide our unconscious steps perchance, if they see fit to intervene. So that tomorrow, being the 11th of the moon of gathering in, is to be celebrated by the noble mandarin with song and wine? Truly the nimble-witted Ming Shu must have slumbered by the way. Assuredly he has but now returned from a long journey. Haply he may start upon a longer. Have the musicians been commanded yet? Even now one goes to inform the leader of their voices and to bid him hold his band in readiness. Let it be your continual aim that nothing bars their progress. Where does that just official dwell of whom you lately spoke? The censor Ko Yi, he who rebuked Shan Tian's ambitions and made him mend his questionable life? His yamen is about the three-eyed gate of Tai, a half-day's journey to the south. The lines converge, and the issues of Shan Tian, Ming Shi, and Wei, who linger here, will presently be brought to a very decisive point where each must play a clear-cut part. To that end is your purpose firm. Lay your commands, replied Hua Mei steadfastly, and measure not the burden of their weight. It is well, agreed Kai Lung. Let Shantien give the feast, and the time of acquiescence will have passed. The foothold of tomorrow looms insecure yet. A very pressing message must meanwhile reach your hands. At the feast? Thus, about the door of the inner hall are two great jars of shining brass, one on either side, and at their approach a step. Being led at that step, I shall stumble. The message you will thereafter find in the jar from which I seek support. It shall be to me as your spoken word. Alas! The moment of recall is already here. Doubt not, we stand on the edge of an era that is immeasurable. For that emergency I now go to consult the spirits who have so far guided us. On the following day at an evening hour, Kai Lung received an imperious summons to accompany one who led him to the inner courts. Yet neither the cords about his arms nor the pillory around his neck could contain the gladness of his heart. From within came the sounds of instruments of wood and string with the measured beating of a drum. Nothing had fallen short, for on that forbidden day, incredibly blind to the depths of his impiety, the ill-starred Mandarin Shantien was having music. "Gal of a misprocured she-mule!" exclaimed the unsympathetic voice of the one who had charge of him, and the rope was jerked to quicken his loitering feet. In an effort to comply, Kai Lung missed the step that crossed his path, and stumbling blindly forward would have fallen had he not struck heavily against a massive jar of lacquered brass, one of two that flanked the door. "Thy province is to tell a tale, rather than to dance a grotesque, as I understand the matter," said the attendant, mollified by the amusement. "In any case, restrain thy admitted ardor for a while. The call is not yet for us." From a group that stood apart some distance from the door one moved forth, and leisurely crossed the hall. Kai Lung's wounded head ceased to pain him. "What slave is this?" she demanded of the other in a slow and level tone. "And wherefore do the two of you intrude on this occasion?" "The exalted lord commands that this one of the prisoners should attend here thus, to divert them with his fancies, he having a certain wit of the more foolish kind. Kai Lung, the dog's name is." "Approach yet nearer to the inner door," enjoined the maiden, indicating the direction, "so that when the message comes there shall be no inept delay." As they moved off to obey, she stood in languid unconcern, leaning across the opening of a tall brass vase, one hand swinging idly in its depths, until they reached their station. Kai Lung did not need his eyes to know. Presently the music ceased, and summoned to appear in turn, Kai Lung stood forth among the guests. On the right hand of the Mandarin reclined the base Main Shu, his mind already vapory with the fumes of wine, the secret malice of his envious mind now boldly leaping from his eyes. "The overrated person now about to try your refined patience to its limit is one who calls himself Kai Lung," declared Ming Shu offensively. "From an early age he has combined minstrelsy with other and more lucrative forms of crime. It is the boast of this contumacious mendicant that he can recite a story to fit any set of circumstances, this, indeed, being the only merit claimed for his feeble entertainment. The test selected for your tolerant amusement on this very second-rate occasion is that he relates the story of a presuming youth who fixes his covetous hopes upon one so far above his degraded state that she and all who behold his uncouth efforts are consumed by helpless laughter. Ultimately he is to be delivered to a severe but well-earned death by a conscientious official whose leisurely purpose is to possess the maiden for himself, although occasionally, bordering on the funereal, the details of the narrative are to be of a light and gravity-removing nature on the whole. Proceed." The storyteller made obeisance towards the Mandarin, whose face meanwhile revealed a complete absence of every variety of emotion. "Have I your genial permission to comply, nobility?" he asked. "The word is spoken," replied Shantien unwillingly. "Let the vaunt be justified. I obey, High Excellence." This involves the story of Hain and the chief examiner. The story of Hain and the chief examiner. In the reign of the Emperor Kong, there lived at Ho Chao an official named Thang Lai, whose degree was that of chief examiner of literary competitions for the district. He had an only daughter, Fa Fei, whose mind was so liberally stored with graceful accomplishments as to give rise to the saying that to be in her presence was more refreshing than to sit in a garden of perfumes listening to the wisdom of 7 elderly philosophers, while her glossy floating hair, skin of crystal luster, crescent nails, and feet smaller and more symmetrical than an opening lotus made her the most beautiful creature in all Ho Chao. Possessing no son and maintaining an open contempt towards all his nearer relations, it had become a habit for Thang Li to converse with his daughter almost on terms of equality, so that she was not surprised on one occasion when, calling her into his presence, he graciously commanded her to express herself freely on whatever subject seemed most important in her mind. The great Middle Kingdom in which we live is not only inhabited by the most enlightened, humane, and courteous-minded race, but is itself fittingly the central and most desirable point of the universe, surrounded by other less favored countries, peopled by races of pigtailless men and large-footed women, all destitute of refined intelligence, replied Fa Fei modestly. The sublime emperor is of all persons the wisest, purest, and undoubtedly, interrupted Thang Li. These truths are of gem-like brilliance, and the ears of a patriotic subject can never be closed to the beauty and music of their ceaseless repetition. Yet, between father and daughter in the security of an inner chamber, there not unnaturally arise topics of more engrossing interest. For example, now that you are of a marriageable age, have your eyes turned in the direction of any particular suitor? Oh, thrice venerated sire! Exclaimed Fa Fei, looking vainly round for some attainable object behind which to conceal her honorable confusion. Should the thoughts of a maiden dwell definitely on a matter of such delicate consequence? They should not, replied her father, but as they invariably do, the speculation is one outside our immediate concern, nor, as it is your wonted custom to ascend upon the outside roof at a certain hour of the morning, is it reasonable to assume that you are ignorant of the movements of the 2 young men who daily contrive to linger before this in no way attractive residence without any justifiable pretext? My father is all-seeing, replied Fa Fei in a commendable spirit of dutiful acquiescence, and also because it seemed useless to deny the circumstance. It is unnecessary, said Thang Li. Surrounded, as he is, by a retinue of 11 female attendants, it is enough to be all-hearing. But which of the 2 has impressed you in the more favorable light? How can the inclinations of an obedient daughter affect the matter? Said Fa Fei evasively. Unless, O most indulgent, it is your amiable intention to permit me to follow the inspiration of my own unfettered choice? Assuredly, replied the benevolent Thang Li, provided, of course, that the choice referred to should by no evil mischance run in a contrary direction to my own maturer judgment. Yet if such an eventuality did happily arise, persisted Fa Fei, none but the irredeemably foolish spend their time in discussing the probable sensation of being struck by a thunderbolt, said Thang Li more coldly. From this day forth, also, be doubly guarded in the undeviating balance of your attitude. Restrain the swallow-like flights of your admittedly brilliant eyes, and control the movements of your expressive fan within the narrowest bounds of necessity. This person's position between the 2 is one of exceptional delicacy, and he has by no means yet decided which to favor. In such a case, inquired Fa Fei, caressing his pigtail persuasively, how does a wise man act, and by what manner of omens is he influenced in his decision? In such a case, replied Thang Li, a very wise man does not act, but maintaining an impassive countenance, he awaits the unrolling of events until he sees what must inevitably take place. It is thus that his reputation for wisdom is built up. Furthermore, said Fa Fei hopefully, the ultimate pronouncement rests with the guarding deities. Unquestionably, agreed Thang Li. Yet, by a venerable custom, the esteem of the maiden's parents is the detail to which the suitors usually apply themselves with the greatest diligence. Of the 2 persons thus referred to by Thang Li, one, Jin Lung, lived beneath the sign of the righteous ink brush. By hereditary right, Sin Lung followed the profession of copying out the more difficult classics in minute characters upon parchments so small that an entire library could be concealed among the folds of a garment, in this painstaking way, enabling many persons who might otherwise have failed at the public examination and been driven to spend an idle and perhaps even dissolute life to pass with honorable distinction to themselves and widespread credit to his resourceful system. One gratified candidate, indeed, had compared his triumphal passage through the many grades of the competition to the luxurious ease of being carried in a sedan chair, and from that time Sin Lung was jestingly referred to as a sedan chair. It might reasonably be thought that a person enjoying this enviable position would maintain a loyal pride in the venerable traditions of his house, and suffer the requirements of his craft to become the four walls of his ambition. Alas! Sin Lung must certainly have been born under the influence of a very evil planet, for the literary quality of his profession did not entice his imagination at all, and his sole and frequently expressed desire was to become a pirate. Nothing but the necessity of obtaining a large sum of money with which to purchase a formidable junk and to procure the services of a band of capable and bloodthirsty outlaws bound him to Ho Chow, unless, perchance, it might be the presence there of Fa Fei after he had once cast his piratical eye upon her overwhelming beauty. The other of the two persons was Hen, a youth of studious desires and unassuming manner. His father had been the chief tax collector of the Chunling Mountains, beyond the town, and although the exact nature of the tax and the reason for its extortion had become forgotten in the process of interminable ages, he himself never admitted any doubt of his duty to collect it from all who passed over the mountains, even though the disturbed state of the country made it impossible for him to transmit the proceeds to the capital. To those who uncharitably extended the envenomed tongue of suspicion towards the very existence of any imperial tax, the father of Hien replied with unshaken loyalty that in such a case the sublime emperor had been very treacherously served by his advisers, as the difficulty of the paths and the intricate nature of the passes rendered the spot peculiarly suitable for the purpose, and as he was accompanied by a well-armed and somewhat impetuous band of followers, his arguments were inevitably successful. When he passed beyond, Hien accepted the leadership, but solely out of a conscientious respect for his father's memory, for his heart was never really in the occupation. His time was almost wholly taken up in reading the higher classics, and even before he had seen Fa Fei his determination had been taken that when once he had succeeded in passing the examination for the second degree, and thereby become entitled to an inferior mandarinship, he would abandon his former life forever. From this resolution the entreaties of his devoted followers could not shake him, and presently they ceased to argue, being reassured by the fact that although Hien presented himself unfailingly for every examination, his name appeared at the foot of each successive list with unvarying frequency. It was at this period that he first came under the ennobling spell of Fa Fei's influence, and from that time forth he redoubled his virtuous efforts. After conversing with her father, as already related, Fa Fei spent the day in an unusually thoughtful spirit. As soon as it was dark, she stepped out from the house, and veiling her purpose under the pretext of gathering some herbs to complete a charm, she presently entered a grove of overhanging cedars where Hien had long been awaiting her footsteps. "Rainbow of my prosaic existence!" he exclaimed, shaking hands with himself courteously. "Have you yet carried out your bold suggestion?" And so acute was his anxiety for her reply that he continued to hold his hand unconsciously until Fa Fei turned away her face in very becoming confusion. "Alas, O my dragon-hearted one," she replied at length, "I have indeed dared to read the scroll, but how shall this person's inelegant lips utter so detestable a truth?" "It is already revealed," said Hien, striving to conceal from her his bitterness. "When the list of competitors at the late examination is publicly proclaimed tomorrow at the 4 gates of the city, the last name to be announced will again, and for the 11th time, be that of the degraded Hien." "Beloved!" exclaimed Fa Fei, resolved that as she could not honorably deny that her Hien's name was again indeed the last one to appear, she would endeavor to lead his mind subtly away to the contemplation of more pleasurable thoughts. It is as you have said, but although your name is the last, it is by far the most dignified and romantic sounding of all, nor is there another throughout the list which can be compared to it for the ornamental grace of its flowing herb-appice. Nevertheless, replied Hing, in a violent access of self-contempt, it is a name of abandoned omen and is destined only to reach the ears of posterity to embellish the proverb of scorn, the lame duck should avoid the plowed field. Can there by no chance have been some hope-inspiring error? Thus were the names inscribed on the parchment, which after the public announcement will be affixed to the Hall of 10,000 lustres, replied Fa Fei. With her own unworthy eyes this incapable person beheld it. The name Hien is in no way striking or profound, continued the one in question, endeavoring to speak as though the subject referred to some person standing at a considerable distance away. Furthermore, so commonplace and devoid of character are its written outlines that it has very much the same appearance whichever way up it is looked at. The possibility that in your graceful confusion you held the list in such a position that what appeared to be the end was in reality the beginning is remote in the extreme. Yet, in spite of an absorbing affection, Fa Fei could not disguise from herself that her feelings would have been more pleasantly arranged if her lover had been inspired to accept his position unquestioningly. There is a detail, hitherto unrevealed, which disposes of all such amiable suggestions, she replied. After the name referred to, someone in authority had inscribed the undeniable comment, as usual. The omen is a most encouraging one, exclaimed Hien, throwing aside all his dejection. Hitherto this person's untiring efforts had met with no official recognition whatever. It is now obvious that far from being lost in the crowd, he is becoming an object of honorable interest to the examiners. One frequently hears it said, after being struck on the head with an axe, it is a positive pleasure to be beaten about the body with a wooden club, said Fa Fei, and the meaning of the formerly elusive proverb is now explained. Would it not? Be prudent to avail yourself at length of the admittedly outrageous Jinlung's services, so that this period of unworthy trial may be brought to a distinguished close. It is said, do not eat the fruit of the stricken branch, replied Hien, and this person will never owe his success to one who is so detestable in his life and morals that with every facility for a scholarly and contemplative existence, he freely announces his barbarous intention of becoming a pirate. Truly the dragon of justice does but sleep for a little time, and when he awakens all that will be left of the mercenary Sin Lung and those who associate with him will scarcely be enough to fill an orange skin. Doubtless it will be so, agreed Fa Fei, regretting, however, that Hien had not been content to prophesy a more limited act of vengeance until at least her father had come to a definite decision regarding her own future. Alas, though. The Book of Dynasties expressly says, the one-legged never stumble, and Sin Lung is so morally ill-balanced that the proverb may even apply to him. Do not fear, said Hien. It is elsewhere written, love and leprosy few escape, and the spirit of Tai Lung's destiny is perhaps even at this moment lurking unsuspected behind some secret place. If, exclaimed a familiar voice, the secret place alluded to should chance to be a hollow cedar tree of inadequate girth, the unfortunate spirit in question will have my concentrated sympathy. Just and magnanimous father, exclaimed Fa Fei, thinking it more prudent not to recognize that he had learned of their meeting place, and concealing himself there had awaited their coming. When your absence was discovered, a heaven-sent inspiration led me to this spot. Have I indeed been permitted here to find you? Assuredly you have, replied Thang Li, who was equally desirous of concealing the real circumstances, although the difficulty of the position into which he had hastily and incautiously thrust his body on their approach compelled him to reveal himself. The same inspiration led me to lose myself in this secluded spot as being the one which you would inevitably search. Yet, by what incredible perversity does it arise, venerable Thang Li, that a leisurely and philosophical stroll should result in a person of your dignified proportions occupying so unattractive a position? Said Hien, who appeared to be too ingenuous to suspect Tang Li's craft, in spite of a warning glance from Fa Fei's expressive eyes. The remark is a natural one, O estimable youth, replied Thang Li, doubtless smiling benevolently, although nothing of his person could be actually seen by Hien or Fa Fei. But the recital is not devoid of humiliation. While peacefully studying the position of the heavens, this person happened to glance into the upper branches of a tree, and among them he beheld a bird's nest of unusual size and richness, one that would promise to yield a dish of the rarest flavor. Lured on by the anticipation of so sumptuous a course, he rashly trusted his body to an unworthy branch, and the next moment, notwithstanding his unceasing protests to the protecting powers, he was impetuously deposited within this hollow trunk. Not unreasonably is it said, "A bird in the soup is better than an eagle's nest in the desert," exclaimed Hien. The pursuit of a fair and lofty object is set about with hidden pitfalls to others beyond you, O noble chief examiner. By what nimble-witted act of adroitness is it now your enlightened purpose to extricate yourself? At this admittedly polite, but in no way inspiring question, a silence of a very acute intensity seemed to fall on that part of the forest. The mild and inscrutable expression of Hien's face did not vary, but into Fa Fei's eyes there came an unexpected but not altogether disapproving radiance, while, without actually altering, the appearance of the tree encircling Thang Li's form undoubtedly conveyed the impression that the benevolent smile, which might hitherto have been reasonably assumed to exist within, had been abruptly withdrawn. "Your meaning is perhaps well-intentioned to gracious Hen," said Thang Li at length, "but as an offer of disinterested assistance, your words lack the gong-like clash of spontaneous enthusiasm. Nevertheless, if you will inconvenience yourself to the extent of climbing this not really difficult tree for a short distance, you will be able to grasp some outlying portion of this one's body without any excessive fatigue." "Mandarin," replied Hien, "to touch even the extremity of your incomparable pigtail would be an honor repaying all earthly fatigue. Do not hesitate to seize it then," said Thinglu, as Hien paused. "Yet, if this person may without ostentation continue the analogy, to grasp him firmly by the shoulders must confer a higher distinction and would be even more agreeable to his own feelings." "The proposal is a flattering one," continued Hien, "but my hands are bound down by the decree of the high powers, for among the most inviolable of the edicts is it not written, 'Do the lame offer to carry the footsore, the blind to protect the one-eyed. Distrust the threadbare person who from an upper back room invites you to join him in an infallible process of enrichment. Turn aside from the one devoid of pigtail who says, Behold, a few drops daily at the hour of the morning sacrifice, and your virtuous head shall be again like a well-sown rice field at the time of harvest, and towards the passing stranger who offers you that mark of confidence which your friends withhold close, and yet again open a different eye. So shall you grow obese in wisdom, alas," exclaimed Thang Li. "The inconveniences of living in an empire where a person has to regulate the affairs of his everyday life by the sacred but antiquated proverbial wisdom of his remote ancestors are by no means trivial. Cannot this possibly mythical obstacle be flattened out by the amiable acceptance of a jar of sea snails or some other seasonable delicacy, honorable Hien? Nothing but a really well-grounded encouragement as regards Fa Fei can persuade this person to regard himself as anything but a solitary outcast," replied Hien, "and one paralyzed in every useful impulse. Rather than abandon the opportunity of coming to such an arrangement, he would almost be prepared to give up all idea of ever passing the examination for the second degree." "By no means," exclaimed Thang Li hastily. "The sacrifice would be too excessive. Do not relinquish your sleuth-hound-like persistence, and success will inevitably reward your ultimate end." "Can it really be," said Heen incredulously, that my contemptible efforts are a matter of sympathetic interest to one so high up in every way as the renowned chief examiner? They are indeed, replied Thang Li, with that ingratiating candor that marked his whole existence. Doubtless, so prosaic a detail as the system of remuneration has never occupied your refined thoughts. But when it is understood that those in the position of this person are rewarded according to the success of the candidates, you will begin to grasp the attitude. In that case, remarked Tien, with conscious humiliation, nothing but a really sublime tolerance can have restrained you from upbraiding this obscure competitor as a thoroughly corrupt egg. On the contrary, replied Thang Li reassuringly, I have long regarded you as the auriferous fowl itself. It is necessary to explain, perhaps, that the payment by result alluded to is not based on the number of successful candidates, but much more reasonably, as all those have to be provided with lucrative appointments by the authorities on the economy, effected to the state by those whom I can conscientiously reject. Owing to the malignant to Sin Lung's sinister dexterity, these form an ever-decreasing band, so that you may now be fittingly deemed the chief prop of a virtuous but poverty-afflicted line. When you reflect that for the past 11 years you have thus really had the honor of providing the engaging Fa-Fei with all the necessities of her very ornamental existence, you will see that you already possess practically all the advantages of matrimony. Nevertheless, if you will now bring our agreeable conversation to an end by releasing this inauspicious person, he will consider the matter with the most indulgent sympathies. Withhold, exclaimed a harsh voice before Heng could reply, and from behind a tree where he had heard Thang Li's impolite reference to himself, Sin Lung stood forth. How does it chance, O two-complexioned chief examiner, that after weighing this one's definite proposals even to the extent of demanding a certain proportion in advance, you are now engaged in holding out the same alluring hope to another? Assuredly, if your existence is so critically imperiled this person, and none other will release you and claim the reward. Turn your face backwards, imperious Chain Lung, cried Heen. These incapable hands alone shall have the overwhelming distinction of drawing forth the illustrious Thang Li. Do not get entangled among my advancing footsteps, immature one, contemptuously replied Sin Lung, shaking the massive armor in which he was encased from head to foot. It is a net for pygmies to stand before one who has every intention of becoming a rapacious pirate shortly. The sedan chair is certainly in need of new shafts, retorted Hien, and drawing his sword with an expression of ferocity he caused it to whistle around his head so loudly that a flock of migratory doves began to arrive, under the impression that others of their tribe were calling them to assemble. Alas! exclaimed Bang Li in an accent of despair. Doubtless the wise Nung Yu was surrounded by disciples, all eager that no other should succor him, when he remarked, "A humble friend in the same village is better than 16 influential brothers in the royal palace. In all this illimitable empire, is there not room for one whose aspirations are bounded by the submerged walls of a predatory junk, and another whose occupation is limited to the upper passes of the Chunling Mountains? Consider the poignant nature of this person's vain regrets if by a couple of evilly directed blows you succeeded at this inopportune moment in exterminating one another. Do not fear, exalted Ban Li, cried Hien, who being necessarily somewhat occupied in preparing himself against Qin Lung's attack, failed to interpret these words as anything but a direct encouragement to his own cause. Before the polluting hands of one who disdains the classics shall be laid upon your sacred extremities, this tenacious person will fix upon his antagonist with a serpent-like embrace and, if necessary, suffer the spirits of both to pass upward in one breath. And to impress Tin Lung with his resolution, he threw away his scabbard and picked it up again several times. Grow large in hope, worthy chief examiner, cried Sin Lung, who from a like cause was involved in a similar misapprehension. Rather shall your imperishable bones adorn the interior of a hollow cedar tree throughout all futurity than you shall suffer the indignity of being extricated by an earth. nurtured sleeve snatcher, and to intimidate him by the display he continued to clash his open hand against his leg armor until the pain became intolerable. "Honorable warriors," implored Tong Li in so agonized a voice, and also because they were weary of the exercise that Hien and Xin Lung paused, "curb your bloodthirsty ambitions for a breathing space and listen to what will probably be a last expression. Believe the passionate sincerity of this one's throat when he proclaims that there would be nothing repugnant to his very keenest susceptibilities if an escaping parricide who was also guilty of rebellion, temple robbing, book burning, murder and indiscriminate violence and the pollution of tombs took him familiarly by the hand at this moment. What, therefore, would be his gratified feelings if two such nobly born subjects joined forces and drew him up dexterously by the body-cloth? Accept his definite assurance that without delay a specific pronouncement would be made respecting the bestowal of the one around whose jade-like personality this encounter has arisen. The proposal casts a reasonable shadow, gracious Hien, remarked Xin Lung, turning towards the other with courteous deference. Shall we bring a scene of irrational carnage to an end and agree to regard the incomparable Thang Li's benevolent tongue as an outstretched olive branch? It is admittedly said every road leads in two directions, and the alternative you suggest, O virtue-loving Tsing Lung, is both reputable and just, replied Hing pleasantly. In this amiable spirit, they extricated Thang Li and bore him to the ground. At an appointed hour he received them with becoming ceremony, and after a many-coursed repast rose to fulfill the specific terms of his pledge. The line of Thang, he remarked with inoffensive pride, has for 7 generations been identified with a high standard of literary achievement. Undeniably, it is a very creditable thing to control the movements of an oft-time erratic vessel and to emerge triumphantly from a combat with every junk you encounter, and it is no less worthy of esteem to gather round about one, on the sterile slopes of the Chunlings, a devoted band of followers. Despite these virtues, however, neither occupation is marked by any appreciable literary flavor, and my word is, therefore, that both persons shall present themselves for the next examination, and when in due course the result is declared, the more successful shall be hailed as the chosen suitor. Lo, I have spoken into a sealed bottle, and my voice cannot vary. Then replied Tien Lung. Truly it is as it is said, astute Thing Li, though the encircling wall of a hollow cedar tree, for example, might impart to the voice in question a less uncompromising ring of finality than it possesses when raised in a silk-lined chamber and surrounded by a band of armed retainers. Nevertheless, the pronouncement is one which appeals to this person's sense of justice, and the only improvement he can suggest is that the superfluous Hien should hasten that ceremony, at which he will be an honored guest by now, signifying his intention of retiring from so certain a defeat. For by what expedient, he continued with arrogant persistence, can you avert that end, O ill-destined Hien? Have you not burned joss sticks to the deities, both good and bad, for 11 years unceasingly? Can you, as this person admittedly can, inscribe the classics with such inimitable delicacy that an entire volume of the Book of Decorum, copied in his most painstaking style, may be safely carried about within a hollow tooth, a lengthy ode, traced on a shred of silk, wrapped undetectably around a single eyelash? It is true that the one before you cannot bend his brush to such deceptive ends, replied Hien modestly. A detail, however, has escaped your reckoning. Hitherto Hin has been opposed by 1,000, and against so many it is true that the spirits of his ancestors have been able to afford him very little help. On this occasion he need regard one adversary alone, giving those forces which he invokes clearly to understand that they need not concern themselves with any other. He will plainly intimate that after so many sacrifices on his part, something of a really tangible affliction is required to overwhelm Tsing Lung. Whether this shall take the form of mental stagnation, bodily paralysis, demoniacal possession, derangement of the internal faculties, or being changed into one of the lower animals, it might be presumptuous on this person's part to stipulate, but by invoking every accessible power and confining himself to this sole petition a very definite tragedy may be expected. Beware, O contumacious lung, however high the tree, the shortest axe can reach its trunk. As the time for the examination drew near, the streets of Waiyu Chao began to wear a fuller and more animated appearance both by day and night. Sin Lung's outer hall was never clear of anxious suppliants, all entreating him to supply them with minute and reliable copies of the passages which they found most difficult in the selected works. But although his low and avaricious nature was incapable of rejecting this means of gain, he devoted his closest energies and his most inspired moments to his own personal copies, a set of books so ethereal that they floated in the air without support, and so cunningly devised in the blending of their color as to be, in fact, quite invisible to any but his microscopic eyes. Hien, on the other hand, devoted himself solely to interesting the powers against his rival's success by every variety of incentive, omen, sacrifice, imprecation, firework, inscribed curse, promise, threat, or combination of inducements. Through the crowded streets and by ways of Ho Chao moved the imperturbable Thang Li, smiling benevolently on those whom he encountered and encouraging each competitor, and especially Hien and Sin Lung, with a cheerful proverb suited to the moment. An outside cause had further contributed to make this period one of the most animated in the annals of Ho Chao, for not only was the city, together with the rest of the imperishable empire, celebrating a great and popular victory, but, as a direct consequence of that event, the sublime emperor himself was holding his court at no great distance away. An armed and turbulent rabble of illiterate barbarians had suddenly appeared in the north and, not giving a really sufficient indication of their purpose, had traitorously assaulted the capital. Had he followed the prompting of his own excessive magnanimity, the charitable monarch would have refused to take any notice whatever of so puny and contemptible a foe. But so unmistakable became the wishes of the ever-victorious army that, yielding to their importunity, he placed himself at their head and resolutely led them backward. Had the opposing army been more intelligent, this crafty move would certainly have enticed them on into the plains, where they would have fallen an easy victim to the imperial troops and all perished miserably. Owing to their low standard of reasoning, however, the mule-like invaders utterly failed to grasp the advantage which, as far as the appearance tended, they might reasonably be supposed to reap by an immediate pursuit. They remained incapably within the capital, slavishly increasing its defenses, while the ever-victorious lurked resourcefully in the neighborhood of Ho Chao, satisfied that with so dull-witted an adversary they could, if the necessity arose, go still further. Upon a certain day of the period thus indicated, there arrived at the gate of the royal pavilion one having the appearance of an aged seer who craved to be led into the imperial presence. "Lo, mightiest," said a slave, bearing in this message, "there stands at the outer gate one resembling an ancient philosopher, desiring to gladden his failing eyesight before he passes up with a brief vision of your illuminated countenance." "The petition is natural but inopportune," replied the agreeable monarch. "Let the worthy soothsayer be informed that after an exceptionally fatiguing day we are now snatching a few short hours of necessary repose, from which it would be unseemly to recall us." He received your gracious words with distended ears, and then observed that it was for your all wisdom to decide whether an inspired message which he had read among the stars was not of more consequence than even a refreshing sleep, reported the slave, returning. "In that case," replied the sublimest, "tell the persevering wizard that we have changed our minds and are religiously engaged in worshipping our ancestors, so that it would be really sacrilegious to interrupt us." He kowtowed profoundly at the mere mention of your charitable occupation, and proceeded to depart, remarking that it would indeed be corrupt to disturb so meritorious an exercise with a scheme simply for your earthly enrichment. Again reported the message-bearer. "Restrain him," hastily exclaimed the broad-minded sovereign. "Give the venerable necromancer clearly to understand that we have worshipped them." "Enough for one day. Doubtless the accommodating soothsayer has discovered some rare jewel which he is loyally bringing to embellish our crown. There are rarer jewels than those which can be pasted in a crown, supreme head, said the stranger, entering unperceived behind the attending slave. He bore the external signs of an infirm magician, while his face was hidden in a cloth to mark the imposition of a solemn vow. With what apter simile, he continued, can this person describe an imperishable set of verses which he heard this morning, falling from the lips of a wandering musician like a seven-roped cable of pearls pouring into a silver bucket? The striking and original title was concerning spring, and although the snow lay deep at the time, several bystanders agreed the azalea bush within hearing came into blossom at the 87th verse. We have heard of the poem to which you refer with so just a sense of balance, said the impartial monarch encouragingly. Though not to create a two-sided impression, it may be freely stated that he himself was the author of the inspired composition. Which part, in your mature judgment, reflected the highest genius, and maintained the most perfectly matched analogy? It is aptly said, when it is dark, the sun no longer shines. But who shall forget the colors of the rainbow? Replied the astrologer evasively. How was it possible to suspend topaz in one cup of the balance and weigh it against amethyst in the other? Or who in a single language can compare the tranquilizing grace of a maiden with the invigorating pleasure of witnessing a well-contested rat fight? Your insight is clear and unbiased, said the gracious sovereign. But however entrancing it is to wander unchecked through a garden of bright images, are we not enticing your mind from another subject of almost equal importance? There is yet another detail, it is true, admitted the sage, but regarding its comparative importance, a thoroughly loyal subject may be permitted to amend the remark of a certain wise emperor of a former dynasty. Any person in the city can discover a score of gold mines if necessary, but one only could possibly have written concerning spring. The arts may indeed be regarded as lost, acquiesced the magnanimous head, with the exception of a solitary meteor here and there. Yet in the trivial matter of mere earthly enrichment, truly, agreed the other. There is, then, a whisper in the province that the floor of the imperial treasury is almost visible. The rumor, as usual, exaggerates the facts grossly, replied the greatest. The floor of the imperial treasury is quite visible, yet on the first day of the next moon the not inconsiderable revenue contributed by those who present themselves for the examination will flow in, and by an effete and unworthy custom almost immediately flow out again to reward the efforts of the successful, replied the wearer of the yellow in an accent of refined bitterness. On other occasions, it is possible to assist the overworked treasurer with a large and glutinous hand, but from time immemorial the claims of the competitors have been inviolable. Yet if by a heaven-sent chance none, or very few, reach the necessary standard of excellence, such a chance, whether proceeding from the upper air or the other parts, would be equally welcome to a very hard-lined ruler, replied the one who thus described himself. Then listen, O Kong Hai, of the imperishable dynasty of Chung, said the Kata. Stranger, thus was it laid upon me in the form of a spontaneous stream. For 7 centuries, the Book of the Observances has been the unvarying classic of the examinations, because during that period it has never been surpassed. Yet, as the empire has admittedly existed from all time, and as it would be impious not to agree that the immortal system is equally antique, it is reasonable to suppose that the Book of the Observances displaced an earlier and inferior work, and is destined in the cycle of time to be itself laid aside for a still greater. The inference is self-evident, acknowledged the emperor uneasily, but the logical development is one which this diffident monarch hesitates to commit to spoken words. It is not a matter for words, but for a stroke of the vermilion pencil, replied the other in a tone of inspired authority. Across the faint and puny effusions of the past, this person sees written in very large and obliterating strokes the words, concerning spring. Where else can be found so novel a conception, combined with so unique a way of carrying it out? What other poem contains so many thoughts that one instinctively remembers as having heard before, so many involved allusions that baffle the imagination of the keenest, and so much sound in so many words? With the possible exception of Monk Hu's masterpiece, The Empty Coffin, what other work so skillfully conveys the impression of being taken down farther than one can ever again come up and then suddenly upraise beyond the possible descent? Where else can be found so complete a defiance of all that has hitherto been deemed essential, and, to insert a final wedge, what other poem is half so long? Your criticism is severe but just, replied the sovereign, except that part having reference to Meng Hu. Nevertheless, the atmosphere of the proposal, though reasonable, looms a degree stormily into a troubled future. Can it be permissible even for omnipotence? Exclaimed the seer. The title is well recalled, confessed the emperor. Yet although unquestionably omnipotent, there must surely be some limits to our powers in dealing with so old established a system as that of the examinations. Who can doubt a universal admission that the composer of Concerning Spring is capable of doing anything, was the profound reply. Let the mandate be sent out, but to an obvious end let it be withheld until the eve of the competitions. The moment of hesitancy has faded. Go forth in the certainty esteemed, said the emperor reassuringly. You have carried your message with a discreet hand, yet before you go, if there is any particular mark of imperial favor that we can show something of a special, but necessarily honorary nature, do not set an iron screen between your ambition and the light of our favorable countenance. There is indeed such a signal reward, assented the aged person, with an air of prepossessing diffidence. A priceless copy of the immortal work by all means, exclaimed the liberal-minded sovereign with an expression of great relief. Take 3 or 4 in case any of your fascinating relations have large literary appetites. Or, still more conveniently arranged, here is an unopened package from the stall of those who send forth the printed leaves, 13 in the semblance of 12, as the quaint and harmonious phrase of their craft has it. Walk slowly, revered, and 1,000 rainbows guide your retiring footsteps. Concerning the episode of this discreetly veiled personage, the historians who have handed down the story of the imperishable affection of Hien and Fa Fei have maintained an illogical silence. Yet it is related that about the same time, as Hen was walking by the side of a bamboo forest of stunted growth, he was astonished by the maiden suddenly appearing before him from the direction of the royal camp. She was incomparably radiant and had the appearance of being exceptionally well satisfied with herself. Commanding him that he should stand motionless with closed eyes in order to ascertain what the presiding deities would allot him, she bound a somewhat weighty object to the end of his pigtail, at the same time asking him in how short a period he could commit about 19,000 lines of atrociously ill-arranged verse to the tablets of his mind. Then do not suffer the rice to grow above your ankles, she continued, when Hien had modestly replied that 6 days with good omens should be sufficient, but retiring to your innermost chamber bar the door, and digest this scroll as though it contained the last expression of an eccentric and vastly rich relation, and with a laugh more musical than the vibrating of a lute of the purest Yunnan jade, in the grotto of 10,000 echoes, she vanished. It has been sympathetically remarked that no matter how painstakingly a person may strive to lead destiny along a carefully prepared path and towards a fit and thoroughly virtuous end, there is never lacking some inopportune creature to thrust his superfluous influence into an opposing balance. This naturally suggests the intolerable Sen Lung, whose ghoulish taste led him to seek the depths of that same glade on the following day. Walking with downcast eyes, after his degraded custom, he presently became aware of an object lying some distance from his way. To those who have already fathomed the real character of this repulsive person, it will occasion no surprise to know that, urged on by the insatiable curiosity that was deeply grafted on to his avaricious nature, he turned aside to probe into a matter with which he had no possible concern, and at length succeeded in drawing a package from the thick bush in which it had been hastily concealed. Finding that it contained 12 lengthy poems entitled Concerning Spring, he greedily thrust one in his sleeve, and upon his return, with no other object than the prompting of an ill-regulated mind, he spent all the time that remained before the contest in learning it from end to end. There have been many remarkable scenes enacted in the great examination halls and in the narrow cells around, but it can at once be definitely stated that nothing either before or since has approached the unanimous burst of frenzy that shook the dynasty of Chung, when in the 3rd year of his reign, the well-meaning but too easily let-aside Emperor Kong inopportunely sought to replace the sublime classic, then in use, with a work that has since been recognized to be not only shallow but inept. At Ho Chao 998, voices blended into one soul benumbing cry of rage, having all the force and precision of a carefully drilled chorus, when the papers were opened, and had not the candidates been securely barred within their solitary pens, a popular rising must certainly have taken place. There they remained for 3 days and nights, until the clamor had subsided into a low but continuous hum, and they were too weak to carry out a combined effort. Throughout this turmoil, Han and Sin Lung each plied an unfaltering brush. It may here be advantageously stated that the former person was not really slow or obtuse, and his previous failures were occasioned solely by the inequality he strove under in relying upon his memory alone, when every other competitor without exception had provided himself with a concealed script. Sin Lung also had a very retentive mind. The inevitable consequence was, therefore, that when the papers were collected, Hien and Sin Lung had accomplished an identical number of correct lines, and no other person had made even an attempt. In explaining Deng Li's subsequent behavior, it has been claimed by many that the strain of being compelled in the exercise of his duty to remain for 3 days and 3 nights in the middle of the hall, surrounded by that ferocious horde, all clamoring to reach him, and the contemplation of the immense sum which he would gain by so unparalleled a batch of rejections, contorted his faculties of discrimination and sapped the resources of his usually active mind. Whatever causes accepted, it is agreed that as soon as he returned to his house, he summoned Hien and Xinglong together, and leaving them for a moment, presently returned, leading Fa Fei by the hand. It is further agreed by all that these 3 persons noticed upon his face a somewhat preoccupied expression, and on the one side much has been made of the admitted fact that as he spoke he wandered round the room catching flies, an occupation eminently suited to his age and leisurely tastes, but, it may be confessed, not altogether well chosen at so ceremonious a moment. "It has been said," he began at length, withdrawing his eyes reluctantly from an unusually large insect upon the ceiling and addressing himself to the maiden, "that there are few situations in life that cannot be honorably settled, and without loss of time, either by suicide, a bag of gold, or by thrusting a despised antagonist over the edge of a precipice upon a dark night. This inoffensive person, however, has striven to arrive at the conclusion of a slight domestic arrangement, both by passively waiting for the event to unroll itself and, at a later period, by the offer of a definite omen. Both of the male persons concerned have applied themselves so tenaciously to the ordeal that the result, to this simple one's antique mind, savors overmuch of the questionable arts. The genial and light-witted emperor appears to have put his foot into the embarrassment ineffectually, and destiny herself has every indication of being disinclined to settle so doubtful a point. As a last resort, it now remains for you yourself to decide which of these strenuous and evenly balanced suitors I may acclaim with 10,000 felicitations." "In that case, venerated and commanding sire," replied Fa Fei simply, yet concealing her real regard behind the retiring mask of a modest indifference, "it shall be Hien, because his complexion goes the more prettily with my favorite, heliotrope silk." When the results of the examination were announced, it was at once assumed by those with whom he had trafficked that Sin Lung had been guilty of the most degraded treachery. Understanding the dangers of his position, that person decided upon an immediate flight. Disguised as a wild beast tamer and leading several apparently ferocious creatures by a cord, He succeeded in making his way undetected through the crowds of competitors watching his house, and hastily collecting his wealth together, he set out towards the coast. But the evil spirits which had hitherto protected him now withdrew their aid. In the wildest passes of the Chunlings, Hyan's band was celebrating his unexpected success by a costly display of fireworks, varied with music and dancing. So heavily did they tax him that when he reached his destination, he was only able to purchase a small and dilapidated junk and to enlist the services of 3 thoroughly incompetent mercenaries. The vessels which he endeavored to pursue stealthily in the hope of restoring his fortunes frequently sailed towards him under the impression that he was sinking and trying to attract their benevolent assistance. When his real intention was at length understood, both he and his crew were invariably beaten about the head with clubs, so that although he persevered until the 3 hired assassins rebelled, he never succeeded in committing a single act of piracy. Afterwards he gained a precarious livelihood by entering into conversation with strangers, and still later he stood upon a board and dived for small coins which the charitable threw into the water. In this pursuit he was one day overtaken by a voracious sea monster and perished miserably. The large meaning but never fully accomplishing Emperor Kong reigned for yet another year, when he was deposed by the powerful League of the 3 brothers. To the end of his life he steadfastly persisted that the rebellion was insidiously fanned, if not actually carried out, by a secret confederacy of all the verse-makers of the empire, who were distrustful of his superior powers. He spent the years of his exile in composing a poetical epitaph to be carved upon his tomb, but his successor, the practical-minded Liu Yen, declined to sanction the expense of procuring so fabulous a supply of marble. When Kai Lung had repeated the story of the well-intentioned youth Hen and of the chief examiner Thong Li and had ceased to speak, a pause of questionable import filled the room, broken only by the undignified sleep noises of the gross Ming Shu. Glances of implied perplexity were freely passed among the guests, but it remained for Shan Tien to voice their doubt. "Yet where is the essence of the test maintained?" he asked, "seeing that the one whom you call Hyan obtained all that which he desired, and he who chiefly opposed his aims was himself involved in ridicule and delivered to a sudden end." "Beneficence," replied Kai Lung with courteous ease, despite the pinions that restrained him. "Herein it is one thing to demand, and another to comply, for among the platitudes is the admission made, no needle has 2 sharp points." The conditions which the subtlety of Ming Shu imposed ceased to bind, for their corollary was inexact. In no romance composed by poet or sage are the unassuming hopes of virtuous love brought to a barren end, or the one who holds them delivered to an ignominious doom. That which was called for does not therefore exist, but the story of Hien may be taken as indicating the actual course of events should the case arise in an ordinary state of life. This reply was not deemed inept by most of those who heard, and they even pressed upon the one who spoke slight gifts of snuff and wine. The Mandarin Shan Tien, however, held himself apart. "It is doubtful if your lips will be able thus to frame so confident a boast when tomorrow fades," was his dark forecast. "Doubtless their tenor will be changed, revered, in accordance with your far seen word," replied Kai Lung submissively as he was led away. Chapter 11, of which it is written, "In shallow water dragons become the laughing stock of shrimps." At an early gong stroke of the following day, Kai Lung was finally brought up for judgment in accordance with the venomous scheme of the reptilian Ming Shu. In order to obscure their guilty plans, all justice-loving persons were excluded from the court, so that when the storyteller was led in by a single guard he saw before him only the 2 whose enmity he faced, and one who stood at a distance prepared to serve their purpose. "Committer of every infamy and inceptor of nameless crimes," began Ming Shu, moistening his brush, "in the past, by the variety of discreditable subterfuges, you have parried the stroke of a just retribution. On this occasion, however, your admitted powers of evasion will avail you nothing. By a special form of administration designed to meet such cases, your guilt will be taken as proved. The technicalities of passing sentence and seeing it carried out will follow automatically. In spite of the urgency of the case, remarked the Mandarin, with an assumption of the evenly balanced expression that at one time threatened to obtain for him the title of the Just, there is one detail which must not be ignored, especially as our ruling will doubtless become a lantern to the feet of later ones. You appear, malefactor, to have committed crimes, and of all these you have been proved guilty by the ingenious arrangement invoked by the learned recorder of my spoken word, which render you liable to hanging, slicing, pressing, boiling, roasting, grilling, freezing, vatting, racking, twisting, drawing, compressing, inflating, rending, spiking, gouging, limb tying, piecemeal pruning, and a variety of less tersely discomforts with which the time of this court need not be taken up. The important consideration is, in what order are we to proceed, and when, if ever, are we to stop? Under your benumbing eye, Excellence, suggested Ming Shu resourcefully, the precedent of taking first that for which the written sign is the longest might be established. Failing that, the names of all the various punishments might be inscribed on separate shreds of parchment, and these deposited within your state umbrella. The first withdrawn by an unbiased High Excellence, Kai Lung ventured to interrupt. A further plan suggests itself which, if, exclaimed Ming Shu in irrational haste, if the criminal proposes to narrate a story of one who in like circumstances, peace, interposed Shan Tien tactfully. The felon will only be allowed the usual 10 short measures of time for his suggestion, nor must he, under that guise, endeavor to insert an imagined tale. Your ruling shall keep straight my bending feet munificence, replied Kai Lung. Hear now my simplifying way, in place of cited wrongs which, after all, are comparatively trivial matters, as being merely offenses against another or in defiance of a local usage substitute. One really overwhelming crime for which the penalty is sharp and explicit. To that end, you would suggest, uncertainty sat upon the brow of both Shan Tien and Ming Shu. To straighten out the entangled thread, this person would plead guilty to the act in a lesser capacity and against his untrammeled will of rejoicing musically on a day set apart for universal woe, a crime aimed directly at the sacred person of the sublime head and all those of his line. At this significant admission, the Mandarin's expression faded. He stroked the lower part of his face several times and unostentatiously indicated to the 2 attendants that they should retire to a more distant obscurity. Then he spoke. When did this alleged indiscretion occur, Kai Lung? He asked in a considerate voice. It is useless to raise a cloud of evasion before the sun of your penetrating intellect, replied the storyteller. The 11th day of the existing moon was its inauspicious date. That being yesterday? Ming Shu, you upon whom the duty of regulating my admittedly vagarious mind devolves, what happened officially on the 11th day of the month of gathering in? Demanded the Mandarin in an ominous tone. On such and such a day benevolence, 75 years ago, the imperishable founder of the existing dynasty ascended on a fiery dragon to be a guest on high, confessed the conscience-stricken scribe after consulting his printed tablets. Owing to the stress of a sudden journey, significance of the date had previously escaped my wee-grown memory. Tolerance, alas! Exclaimed Shan Tien bitterly. Among the innumerable drawbacks of an exacting position, the enforced reliance upon an unusually inept and more than ordinarily self-opinionated inscriber of the spoken word is perhaps the most illimitable. Owing to your profuse incompetence, that which began as an agreeable prelude to a busy day has turned into a really serious matter. Yet lenience, pleaded the hapless Ming Shu, lowering his voice for the Mandarin's private ear. So far, the danger resides in this one throat alone. That disposed of perchance, replied Shan Tien, then turning to Kai Lung. Doubtless, O storyteller, you were so overcome by the burden of your guilt that until this moment you have hidden the knowledge of it deep within your heart. Magnificence, the commanding quality of your enduring voice would draw the inner matter from a marrow bone. frankly replied Kai Lung. Fearful lest this crime might go unconfessed and my weak and trembling ghost therefrom be held to bear its weight unto the end of time, I set out the full happening in a written scroll and sent it at daybreak by a sure and secret hand to a scrupulous official to deal with as he sees fit. Your worthy confidant would assuredly be a person of incorruptible integrity. The repute of the upright censor Kaiohe it reached even these stunted ears. Inevitably, the censor Shantian's hasty glance took in the angle of the sun, and for a moment rested on the door leading to the part where his swiftest horses lay. By this time, the message will have reached him. Omnipotence, replied Kai Lung, spreading out his hands to indicate the full extent of his submission. Not even a piece of the finest Pinghai silk could be inserted between the deepest secret of this person's heart and your all-extracting gaze. Should you, in your meritorious sense of justice, impose upon me a punishment that would seem to be adequate, it would be superfluous to trouble the obliging censor in the matter. To this end, the one who bears the message lurks in a hidden corner of Tai until a certain hour. If I am in a position to intercept him there, he will return the message to my hand. If not, he will straightway bear it to the integratist Kuei Ya. May the President of Hades reward you. I am no longer in a position to do so, murmured Shan Tian with concentrated feeling. Draw near, Kai Lung, he continued sympathetically, and indicate with as little delay as possible what in your opinion would constitute a sufficient punishment. Thus invited and with his cords unbound, Kai Lung advanced and took his station near the table, Ming Shu noticeably making room for him. To be driven from your lofty presence and never again permitted to listen to the wisdom of your inspired lips would undoubtedly be the first essential of my penance, High Excellence. It is gran inflicted, agreed Shan Tian, with swift decision. The necessary edict may conveniently be drafted in the form of a safe conduct for this person and all others of his band to a point beyond the confines of your jurisdiction when the usually agile-witted Ming Shu can sufficiently shake off the benumbing torpor now assailing him so as to use his brush. It has already begun, O virtuous harbinger of joy, protested the dazed Ming Shu, overturning all the four precious implements in his passion to comply. A mere breath of time, let it be signed, sealed, and thumb-pressed at every available point of ambiguity, enjoined Shan Tian. Having thus oppressed the vainglory of my self-willed mind, the presumption of this unworthy body must be subdued likewise. The burden of 500 taels of silver should suffice. If not in the form of paper obligations, estimable Kai Lung, the same amount would go more conveniently within your scrip, suggested the Mandarin hopefully. Not convenience, O Mandarin, but bodily exhaustion is the essence of my task, reproved the storyteller. Yet consider the anguish of my internal pang. If thus encumbered, you sank spent by the wayside, and being thereby unable to withhold the message, you were called upon to endure a further ill. That indeed is worthy of our thought, confessed Kai Lung. To this end, I will further mortify myself by adventuring upon the uncertain apex of a trustworthy steed, a mode of progress new to my experience, until I enter Tai. The swiftest and most reputable awaits your guiding hand, replied Shan Tian. Let it be enticed forth into a quiet and discreet spot. In the interval, while the obliging Ming Shu plies an unfaltering brush, the task of weighing out my humiliating burden shall be ours. In an incredibly short space of time, being continually urged on by the flattering anxiety of Shan Tian, whose precipitancy at one point became so acute that he mistook 80 taels for 5, all things were prepared. With the inscribed parchment well within his sleeve and the bags of silver ranged about his body, Kai Lung approached the platform that had been raised to enable him to subdue the expectant animal. Once in the desired position, weighted down as you are, there is little danger of your becoming displaced, remarked the Mandarin auspiciously. Your words are, as usual, many-sided in their wise application, benignity, replied Kai Lung. One thing only yet remains. It is apart from the expression of this one's will, but as an act of justice to yourself and in order to complete the analogy. And he indicated the direction of Ming Shu. Nevertheless, you are agreeably understood, declared Shantian, moving apart. Farewell. As those who controlled the front part of the horse at this moment relaxed their tenacity, Kai Lung did not deem it prudent to reply, nor was he specifically observant of the things about. But a little later, while in the act of permitting the creature whose power he ruled to turn round for a last look at its former home, he saw that the unworthy no longer flourished. Ming Shu, with his own discarded kang around his vindictive neck, was being led off in the direction of the prison house. Chapter 12. The outpassing into a state of assured felicity of the much enduring two with whom these printed leaves have chiefly been concerned. Although it was toward sunset, the heat of the day still hung above the dusty earth road, and two who tarried within the shadow of an ancient arch were loath to resume their way. They had walked far, for the uncertain steed, having revealed a too contentious nature, had been disposed of in distant tie to an honest stranger who freely explained the imperfection of its ignoble outline. "Let us remain another space of time," pleaded Hua Mei reposefully, "and as without your all-embracing art the course of events would undoubtedly have terminated very differently from what it has, will you not, out of an emotion of gratitude, relate a story for my ear alone, weaving into it the substance of this ancient arch whose shade proves our rest?" "Your wish is the crown of my attainment, unearthly one," replied Kai Lung, preparing to obey. This concerns the story of Ten Te, whose name adorns the keystone of the fabric. The story of the loyalty of Ten Te, the fisherman's devotion to the emperor. The 5 great principles. The reign of the enlightened Emperor Tungwei had closed amid scenes of treachery and lust, and in his perfidiously spilled blood was extinguished the last pale hope of those faithful to his line. His only son was a nameless fugitive by ceaseless report already, passed beyond his party, scattered and crushed out like the sparks from his blackened capital, while nothing that men thought dare pass their lips. The usurper Fu Chi sat upon the dragon throne and spake with the voice of brass cymbals and echoing drums, his right hand shedding blood and his left hand spreading fire. To raise an eye before him was to ape with death, and a whisper in the outer ways foreran swift torture. With harrows he uprooted the land until no household could gather round its ancestral tablets, and, with marble rollers, he flattened it until none dare lift his head. For the body of each one who had opposed his ambition, there was offered an equal weight of fine silver, and upon the head of the child prince was set the reward of 10 times his weight in pure gold. Yet in noisome swamps and forests, hidden in caves, lying on desolate islands, and concealing themselves in every kind of solitary place, were those who daily prostrated themselves to the memory of Tungwei, and by a sign acknowledged the authority of his infant son, Quo Kam. In the Crystal City there was a great roar of violence and drunken song, and men and women lapped from deep lakes filled up with wine. But the rice axe of the poor had long been turned out and shaken for a little dust. Their eyes were closing, and in their hearts they were as powder between the millstones. On the north and the west, the barbarians had begun to press forward in resistless waves, and from the island to the beak pirates laid waste the coast. Aye, under the dragon's wing. Among the lagoons of the upper Sang River, a cormorant fisher, Ten Te by name, daily followed his occupation. And seasons of good harvest, when they of the villages had grain in abundance and money with which to procure a more varied diet, Ten Te was able to regard the ever-changeful success of his venture without anxiety, and even to add perchance somewhat to his store. But when affliction lay upon the land, the carefully gathered hoard melted away, and he did not cease to upbraid himself for adopting so uncertain a means of livelihood. At these times the earth-tillers, having neither money to spend nor crops to harvest, caught such fish as they could for themselves. Others, in their extremity, did not scruple to drown themselves and their dependents in Ten Te's waters, so that while none contributed to his prosperity, the latter ones even greatly added to the embarrassment of his craft. When, therefore, his own harvest failed him in addition, or tempests drove him back to a dwelling which was destitute of food either for himself, his household, or his cormorants, his self-reproach did not appear to be ill-reasoned. Yet in spite of all, Tente was of a genial disposition, benevolent, respectful, and incapable of guile. He sacrificed adequately at all festivals, and his only regret was that he had no son of his own and very scanty chances of ever becoming rich enough to procure one by adoption. The sun was setting one day when Tente reluctantly took up his propelling staff and began to urge his raft towards the shore. It was a season of parched crops and destitution in the villages, where disease could fondle the bones of even the most rotund, and leprosy was the insidious condiment in every dish. Yet never had the imperial dues been higher, and each succeeding official had larger hands and a more inexorable face than the one before him. Tente's hoarded resources had already followed the snows of the previous winter. His shelf was like the heart of a despot to whom the oppressed cry for pity, and the contents of the creel at his feet were too insignificant to tempt the curiosity even of his hungry cormorants. But the mists of the evening were by this time lapping the surface of the waters, and he had no alternative but to abandon his fishing for the day. Truly they who go forth to fish, even in shallow waters, experience strange things when none are by to credit them, suddenly exclaimed his assistant, a mentally deficient youth of the villages whom Tente charitably employed because all others rejected him. "Behold, master, a spectre bird approaches." "Peace, witless," replied Tente, not turning from his occupation, for it was no uncommon incident for the deficient youth to mistake widely differing objects for one another, or to claim a demoniacal insight into the most trivial happenings. "Visions do not materialize for such as thou and I." "Nevertheless," continued the weakling, "if you will but slacken your agile proficiency with the pole, chieftain, our supper tonight may yet consist of something more substantial than the fish which it is our intention to catch tomorrow." When the defective youth had continued for some time in this meaningless strain, Tente turned to rebuke him, when to his astonishment he perceived that a strange cormorant was endeavoring to reach them, its progress being impeded by an object which it carried in its mouth. Satisfying himself that his own birds were still on the raft, Tente looked round in expectation for the boat of another fisherman, although none but he had ever within his memory sought those waters. But as far as he could see, the wide-stretching lagoon was deserted by all but themselves. He accordingly waited, drawing in his pole and inciting the bird on by cries of encouragement. "A nobly born cormorant, without doubt," exclaimed the youth approvingly. "He is lacking the throat strap, yet he holds his prey dexterously and makes no movement to consume it. But the fish itself is outlined strangely." As the bird drew near, Tente also saw that it was devoid of the usual strap, which in the exercise of his craft was necessary as a barrier against the gluttonous instincts of the race. It was unnaturally large, and even at a distance, Tente could see that its plumage was smooth to a polished luster, its eye alert, and the movement of its flight untamed. But, as the youth had said, the fish it carried loomed mysteriously. "The wise one and the crafty image, behold they prostrate themselves," cried the youth in a tone of awe-inspired surprise, and without a pause he stepped off the raft and submerged himself beneath the waters. It was even as he asserted. Tente turned his eyes, and lo, his two cormorants, instead of rising in anger, as their contentious nature prompted, had sunk to the ground and were doing obeisance. Much perturbed as to his own most prudent action, for the bird was nearing the craft, Tente judged it safest to accept this token, and falling down he thrice knocked his forehead submissively. When he looked up again, the majestic bird had vanished as utterly as the flame that is quenched, and lying at his feet was a naked man-child. "O master," said the voice of the assistant as he cautiously protruded his head above the surface of the raft, Has the vision faded, or do creatures of the air before whom even their own kind kowtow still haunt the spot? The manifestation has withdrawn, replied Tente reassuringly. But like the touch of the omnipotent Buddha, it has left behind it that which proves its reality. And he pointed to the man-child. Beware, alas, exclaimed the youth, preparing to immerse himself a second time if the least cause arose. And on no account permit yourself to be drawn into the snare. Inevitably, the affair tends to evil from the beginning, and presently that which now appears as a man-child will assume the form of a devouring vampire and consume us all. Such occurrences are by no means uncommon when the great sky lantern is at its full distension. To maintain otherwise would be impious, admitted his master, but at the same time there is nothing to indicate that the beneficial deities are not the ones responsible for this apparition. With these humane words, the kindly disposed Tente wrapped his outer robe about the man-child and turned to lay him in the empty creel, when to his profound astonishment he saw that it was now filled with fish of the rarest and most unapproachable kinds. "Footsteps of the dragon!" exclaimed the youth, scrambling back onto the raft hastily. "Undoubtedly your acuter angle of looking at the visitation was the inspired one. Let us abandon the man-child in an unfrequented spot, and then proceed to divide the result of the adventure equally among us." "An agreed portion shall be allotted," replied Tente, "but to abandon so miraculously endowed a being would cover even an outcast with shame." "Shame fades in the morning. Debts remain from day to day," replied the youth, the allusion of the proverb being to the difficulty of sustaining life in times so exacting. When men pledge their household goods, their wives, even their ancestral records, for a little flour or a jar of oil, to the starving the taste of a grain of corn is more satisfying than the thought of a roasted ox. But as many years must pass as this creel now holds fish before the little one can disengage a catch or handle the pole. "It is as the many-eyed one sees," replied Tinte, with unmoved determination. "This person has long desired a son, and those who walk into an earthquake while imploring heaven for a sign are unworthy of consideration. Take this fish and depart until the morrow. Also, unless you would have the villagers regard you as not only deficient but profane, reveal nothing of this happening to those whom you encounter." With these words, Tintiai dismissed him, not greatly disturbed at the thought of whatever he might do. For in no case would any believe a word he spoke, while the greater likelihood tended towards his forgetting everything before he had reached his home. As Tenti approached his own door, his wife came forth to meet him, much gladness. She cried aloud before she saw his burden, tempered only by a regret that you did not abandon your chase at an earlier hour. "Fear not for the present that the wolf tusk of famine shall gnaw our repose, or that the dreaded wings of the white and scaly one shall hover about our housetop. Your wealthy cousin, journeying back to the capital from the land of the spice forests, has been here in your absence, leaving you gifts of fur, silk, carved ivory, oil, wine, nuts and rice, and rich foods of many kinds. He would have stayed to embrace you were it not that his company of bearers awaited him at an arranged spot, and he had already been long delayed." Then said Tente, well knowing that he had no such desirable relative. But, drawn to secrecy by the unnatural course of events, the years pass unperceived and all changes but the heart of man. How appeared my cousin, and has he greatly altered under the enervating sun of a barbarian land? He is now a little man, with a loose skin the color of a finely lacquered apricot, replied the woman. His teeth are large and jagged, his expression open and sincere, and the sound of his breathing is like the continuous beating of waves upon a stony beach. Furthermore, he has 10 fingers upon his left hand and a girdle of rubies about his waist. The description is unmistakable, said Tente evasively. Did he chance to leave a parting message of any moment? He twice remarked, "When the sun sets, the moon rises, but tomorrow the dawn will break again," replied his wife. Also, Upon leaving, he asked for ink, brushes, and a fan, and upon it he inscribed certain words. She thereupon handed the fan to Tenta, who read, written in characters of surpassing beauty and exactness, the proverb, well-guarded lips, patient alertness, and a heart conscientiously discharging its accepted duty, these three things have a sure reward. At that moment, Tintei's wife saw that he carried something beyond his creel, and discovering the man-child, she cried out with delight, pouring forth a torrent of inquiries and striving to possess it. "A tale half told is the father of many lies," exclaimed Tinte at length, "and of the greater part of what you ask this person knows neither the beginning nor the end. Let what is written on the fan suffice." With this he explained to her the meaning of the characters and made their significance clear. Then without another word he placed the man-child in her arms and led her back into the house. From that time Hoang, as he was thenceforward called, was received into the household of Tente, and from that time Tente prospered. Without ever approaching a condition of affluence or dignified ease, he was never exposed to the penury and vicissitudes which he had been wont to experience, so that none had need to go hungry or ill-clad. If famine ravaged the villages, Tente's store of grain was miraculously maintained. His success on the lagoons was unvaried, fish even leaping onto the structure of the raft. Frequently in dark and undisturbed parts of the house, he found sums of money and other valuable articles of which he had no remembrance, while it was no uncommon thing for passing merchants to leave bales of goods at his door in mistake, and to meet with some accident which prevented them from ever again visiting that part of the country. In the meanwhile, Huang grew from infancy into childhood, taking part with Tenti in all his pursuits, yet even in the most menial occupation, never wholly shaking off the air of command and nobility of bearing which lay upon him. In strength and endurance he outpaced all the youths around, while in the manipulation of the raft and the dexterous handling of the cormorants he covered Tente with gratified shame. So excessive was the devotion which he aroused in those who knew him that the deficient youth wept openly if Hoang chanced to cough or sneeze. And it is even asserted that on more than one occasion high officials, struck by the authority of his presence, though he might be in the act of carrying fish along the road, hastily descended from their chairs and prostrated themselves before him. In the 14th year of the reign of the usurper Fuqi, a little breeze rising in the province of Xuqian began to spread through all the land, and men's minds were again agitated by the memory of a hope which had long seemed dead. At that period, the tyrannical Fuqi finally abandoned the last remaining vestige of restraint, and by his crimes and excesses alienated even the protection of the evil spirits and the fidelity of his chosen guard, so that he conspired with himself to bring about his own destruction. One discriminating adviser alone had stood at the foot of the throne, and being no less resolute than far-seeing, he did not hesitate to warn Fuqi and to hold the prophetic threat of rebellion before his eyes. Such sincerity met with the reward not difficult to conjecture. "Who are our enemies?" exclaimed Fuqi, turning to a notorious flatterer at his side. "And where are they who are displeased with our too lenient rule? Your enemies, O brother of the sun and prototype of the red-legged crane, are dead and unmourned. The living do not but speak of your clemency and bask in the radiance of your eyelight," protested the flatterer. "It is well said," replied Fuqi. "How is it, then, that any can eat of our rice and receive our bounty and yet repay us with ingratitude and taunts, holding their joints stiffly in our presence? Lo, even lambs have the grace to suck kneeling." "Omnipotence," replied the just minister, "if this person is deficient in the more supple graces of your illustrious court, it is because the greater part of his life has been spent in waging your wars in uncivilized regions. Nevertheless, the alarm can be as competently sounded upon a brass drum as by a silver trumpet," and his words came forth from a sincere throat. "Then the opportunity is by no means to be lost," exclaimed Fuqi, who was by this time standing some distance from himself, "in the effects of distilled pear juice. For we have long desired to see the difference, which must undoubtedly exist between a sincere throat and one bent to the continual use of evasive flattery. Without further consideration, he ordered that both persons should be beheaded and that their bodies should be brought for his inspection. From that time there was none to stay his hand or to guide his policy, so that he mixed blood and wine and foolishness and lust until the land was sick and heaved. The whisper starting from Sichuan passed from house to house and from town to town until it had cast a network over every province, yet no man could say whence it came or by whom the word was passed. It might be in the manner of a greeting or the pledging of a cup of tea, by the offer of a coin to a blind beggar at the gate, in the fold of a carelessly worn garment, or even by the passing of a leper through a town. Oppression still lay heavily upon the people, but it was without aim and carried no restraint. Famine and pestilence still went hand in hand, but the message rode on their backs and was hospitably received. Soon, growing bolder, men stood face to face and spoke of settled plans, gave signs, and openly declared themselves. On all sides proclamations began to be affixed. Next weapons were distributed, hands were made proficient in their uses, until nothing remained but definite instruction and a swift summons for the appointed day. At intervals omens had appeared in the sky and prophecies had been put into the mouths of soothsayers, so that of the success of the undertaking and of its justice none doubted. On the north and the west entire districts had reverted to barbarism, and on the coasts the pirates anchored by the water gates of walled cities and tossed jests to the watchmen on the towers. Throughout this period, Tin Tay had surrounded Hoang with an added care, never permitting him to wander beyond his sight and distrusting all men in spite of his confiding nature. One night, when a fierce storm beyond the memory of man was raging, there came at the middle hour a knocking upon the outer wall, loud and insistent. Nevertheless, Tintadee did not at once throw open the door in courteous invitation, but drawing aside a shutter, he looked forth. Before the house stood one of commanding stature, clad from head to foot in robes composed of plaited grasses dyed in many colors. Around him ran a stream of water, while the lightning issuing in never-ceasing flashes from his eyes revealed that his features were rugged and his ears pierced with many holes from which the wind whistled until the sound resembled the shrieks of 10,000 tortured ones under the branding iron. From him the tempest proceeded in every direction, but he stood unmoved among it, without so much as a petal of the flowers he wore disarranged. In spite of these indications, and of the undoubted fact that the being could destroy the house with a single glance, Tin Tay still hesitated. The night is dark and stormy, and robbers and evil spirits are certainly about in large numbers, striving to enter unperceived by any open door, he protested, but with becoming deference. With what does your welcome and opportune visit concern itself, honorable stranger? The one before you was not accustomed to be questioned in his doings, or even to be spoken to by ordinary persons, replied the being. Nevertheless, Tin Tay, there is that in your history for the past 14 years which saves you from the usual fatal consequences of so gross an indiscretion. Let it suffice that it is concerned with the flight of the cormorant. Upon this assurance, Tin Tay no longer saw evasion. He hastened to throw open the outer door, and the stranger entered, whereupon the tempest ceased, although the thunder and lightning still lingered among the higher mountains. In passing through the doorway, the robe of plaited grasses caught for a moment on the staple, and pulling aside revealed that the being wore upon his left foot a golden sandal, and upon his right foot one of iron, while embedded in his throat was a great pearl. Convinced by this that he was indeed one of the immortal eight, Tin Tay prostrated himself fittingly, and explained that the apparent disrespect of his reception arose from a conscientious interest in the safety of the one committed to his care. "It is well," replied the being affably, "and your unvarying fidelity shall not go unrewarded when the proper time arrives. Now bring forward the one whom hitherto you have wisely called Hoang." In secret during the past years, Tin Tay had prepared for such an emergency a yellow silk robe bearing embroidered on it the imperial dragon with 5 claws. He had also provided suitable ornaments, fur coverings for the hands and face, and a sword and shield. Waking Hong, he quickly dressed him, sprinkled a costly perfume about his head and face, and taking him for the last time by the hand, he led him into the presence of the stranger. Quo Kam, chosen representative of the sacred line of Tang, began the being. When he and Hoang had exchanged signs and greetings of equality in an obscure tongue, the grafted peach tree on the crystal wall is stricken, and the fruit is ripe and rotten to the touch. The flies that have fed upon its juice are drunk with it and lie helpless on the ground. The skin is empty and blown out with air, the leaves withered, and about the root is coiled a great worm which has secretly worked to this end. From the 5 points of the kingdom and beyond the outer willow circle the sheaf-binders have made a full report, and it has been judged that the time is come for the tree to be roughly shaken. To this destiny the old ones of your race now call you, but beware of setting out unless your face should be unchangingly fixed and your heart pure from all earthly desires and base considerations. The decision is too ever present in my mind to need reflection, replied Huang resolutely. To grind to powder that presumptuous tyrant utterly, to restore the integrity of the violated boundaries of the land, and to set up again the venerable tablets of the true Tang line, these desires have long since worn away the softer portion of this person's heart by constant thought. The choice has been made and the words have been duly set down, said the dome. Being, if you maintain your high purpose to a prosperous end, nothing can exceed your honor in the upper air. If you fail culpably, or even through incapacity, the lot of Fuchi himself will be enviable compared with yours. Understanding that the time had now come for his departure, Huang approached Tente as though he would have embraced him. But the being made a gesture of restraint. Yet, O instructor, for the space of 14 years, protested Huang. It has been well and discreetly accomplished, replied the being in a firm but not unsympathetic voice, and Team T's reward, which shall be neither slight nor grudging, is awaiting him in the upper air, where already his immediate ancestors are very honorably regarded in consequence. For many years, O Tente, there has dwelt beneath your roof one who from this moment must be regarded as having passed away without leaving even a breath of memory behind. Before you stands your sovereign, to whom it is seemly that you should prostrate yourself in unquestioning obeisance. Do not look for any recompense or distinction here below in return for that which you have done towards a nameless one, for in the state there are many things which for high reasons cannot be openly proclaimed for the ill-disposed to use as feathers in their darts. Yet take this ring. The ears of the illimitable emperor are never closed to the supplicating petition of his children, and should such a contingency arise, you may freely lay your cause before him with the full assurance of an unswerving justice. A moment later the storm broke out again with redoubled vigor, and raising his face from the ground, Tente perceived that he was again alone. The messes from the outer land. After the departure of Hoang, the affairs of Tente ceased to prosper. The fish which for so many years had leaped to meet his hand now maintained an unparalleled dexterity in avoiding it. Continual storms drove him day after day back to the shore, and the fostering beneficence of the deities seemed to be withdrawn, so that he no longer found forgotten stores of wealth, nor did merchants ever again mistake his door for that of another to whom they were indebted. In the year that followed, there passed from time to time through the secluded villages lying in the upper Sang Valley persons who spoke of the tumultuous events progressing everywhere. In such a manner, those who had remained behind learned that the great rising had been honorably received by the justice-loving in every province, but that many of official rank, inspired by no friendship towards Fuchi, but terror-stricken at the alternatives before them, had closed certain strong cities against the army of the avenging pure. It was at this crisis, when the balance of the nation's destiny hung poised, that Quol Kam, the only son of the Emperor Tungui and rightful heir of the dynasty of the Glorious Tang, miraculously appeared at the head of the avenging pure, and being acclaimed their leader with a unanimous shout, led them on through a series of overwhelming and irresistible victories. At a later period, it was told how Quocom had been crowned and installed upon his father's throne, after receiving a mark of celestial approbation in the temple of heaven, how Fuchi had escaped and fled, and how his misleading records had been publicly burned and his detestable name utterly blotted out. At this period, an even greater misfortune than his consistent ill success met Tente. A neighboring mandarin, on a false pretext, caused him to be brought before him, and speaking very sternly of certain matters in the past, which, he said, out of a well-intentioned regard for the memory of Tinti's father, he would not cast abroad, he fined him a much larger sum than all he possessed, and then at once caused the raft and the cormorants to be seized in satisfaction of the claim. This he did because his heart was bad, and the sight of Tinti bearing a cheerful countenance under continual privation had become offensive to him. The story of this act of rapine Tente at once carried to the appointed head of the village communities, assuring him that he was ignorant of the cause, but that no crime or wrongdoing had been committed to call for so overwhelming an affliction in return, and entreating him to compel a just restitution and liberty to pursue his inoffensive calling peaceably in the future. Listen well, O unassuming Tente, for you are a person of discernment, and one with a mature knowledge of the habits of all swimming creatures, said the headman after attending patiently to Tente's words. If two lean and insignificant carp encountered a voracious pike and one at length fell into his jaws, by what means would the other compel the assailant to release his prey? So courageous an emotion would serve no useful purpose, replied Tente. Being ill-equipped for such a conflict, it would inevitably result in the second. Fish also falling a prey to the voracious pike, and recognizing this, the more fortunate of the two would endeavor to escape by lying unperceived among the reeds about. The answer is inspired and at the same time sufficiently concise to lie within the hollow bowl of an opium pipe, replied the headman, and turning to his bench, he continued in his occupation of beating flax with a wooden mallet. Yet, protested Tente, when at length the other paused, surely the matter could be placed before those in authority in so convincing a light by one possessing your admitted eloquence that justice would stumble over herself in her haste to liberate the oppressed and to degrade the guilty. The phenomenon has occasionally been witnessed, but latterly it would appear that the conscientious deity in question must have lost all power of movement, or perhaps even fatally injured herself as the result of some such act of rash impulsiveness in the past, replied the headman sympathetically. Alas, then, exclaimed Tente, is there, under the most enlightened form of government in the world, no prescribed method of obtaining redress? Assuredly, replied the headman, the prescribed method is the part of the system that has received the most attention. As the one of whom you complain is a mandarin of the 5th degree, you may fittingly address yourself to his superiors of the 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and 1st degrees. Then there are the city governors, the district prefects, the provincial rulers, the imperial assessors, the board of censors, the guider of the vermilion pencil, and, finally, the supreme emperor himself. To each of these, if you are wealthy enough to reach his actual presence, you may prostrate yourself in turn, and each one, with many courteous expressions of intolerable regret that the matter does not come within his office, will refer you to another. The more prudent course, therefore, would seem to be that of beginning with the emperor rather than reaching him as the last resort, and as you are now without means of livelihood if you remain here, there is no reason why you should not journey to the capital and make the attempt. The highest, exclaimed Tente, with a pang of unfathomable emotion. Is there, then, no middle way? Who is Tente, the obscure and illiterate fisherman, that he should thrust himself into the presence of the Son of Heaven? If the mother of the dutiful Zhou Yi could destroy herself and her family at one blow to the end that her son might serve his sovereign with a single heart, how degraded an outcast must he be who would obtrude his own trivial misfortunes at so critical a time? A thorn in one's own little finger is more difficult to endure than a sword piercing the sublime emperor's arm, replied the headman, resuming his occupation. But if your angle of regarding the various obligations is as you have, stated it, then there is obviously nothing more to be said. In any case, it is more than doubtful whether the fountain of justice would raise an eyelash if you, by every combination of fortunate circumstance, succeeded in reaching his presence. The headman has spoken, and his word is 10 times more weighty than that of an ill-educated fisherman, replied Tin Ti submissively, and he departed. From that time Tin Ti sought to sustain life upon roots and wild herbs, which he collected laboriously and not always in sufficient quantities from the woods and rank wastes around. Soon even this resource failed him in a great measure, for a famine of unprecedented harshness swept over that part of the province. All supplies of adequate food ceased, and those who survived were driven by the pangs of hunger to consume weeds and the bark of trees, fallen leaves, insects of the lowest orders, and the bones of wild animals which had died in the forest. 2. Carry a little rice openly was a rash challenge to those who still valued life, and a loaf of chaff and black mold was guarded as a precious jewel. No wife or daughter could weigh in the balance against a measure of corn, and men sold themselves into captivity to secure the coarse nourishment which the rich allotted to their slaves. Those who remained in the villages followed in Tin Ti's footsteps, so that the meager harvest that hitherto had failed to supply one household now constituted the whole provision for many. At length these persons, seeing a lingering but inevitable death before them all, came together and spoke of how this might perchance be avoided. "Let us consider well," said one of their number, "for it may be that succor would not be withheld did we but know the precise manner in which to invoke it." "Your words are light, O Tan Young, and your eyes too bright in looking at things which present no encouragement whatever," replied another. "We who remain are old, infirm, or in some way deficient, or we would ere this have sold ourselves into slavery or left this accursed desert in search of a more prolific land. Therefore our existence is of no value to the state, so that they will not take any pains to preserve it. Furthermore, now being beyond the grasp of the most covetous extortion, the district officials have no reason for maintaining an interest in our lives. Assuredly there is no escape except by the white door, of which each one himself holds the key." "Yet," objected a third, "the aged Ning has often recounted how in the latter years of the reign of the charitable Emperor Kwang, when a similar infliction lay upon the land, a bullock load of rice was sent daily into the villages of the valley and freely distributed by the headman. Now that same munificent Kwang was a direct ancestor to the 3rd degree of our own Quocom." "Alas," remarked a person who had lost many of his features during a raid of brigands, "since the days of the commendable Kwang, while the feet of our lesser ones have been growing smaller, the hands of our greater ones have been growing larger. Yet even nowadays, by the protection of the deities, the bullock might reach us. The wheel grease of the cart would alone make the day memorable," murmured another. "O brothers," interposed one who had not yet spoken, "do not cause our throats to twitch convulsively, nor is it in any way useful to leave the date of solid reflection in pursuit of the stone of light and versatile fancy. Is it thought to be expedient that we should send an emissary to those in authority, pleading our straits? Have not 2 already journeyed to Kunyi in our cause, and to what end?" replied the second one who had raised his voice. "They did but seek the city mandarin and failed to reach his ear, being empty-handed," urged Tan Young. "The distance to the capital is admittedly great, yet it is no more than a persevering and resolute-minded man could certainly achieve. There prostrating himself before the Sublime One and invoking the memory of the imperishable Kwang, he could so outline our necessity and despair that the one wagon load referred to would be increased by 9, and the unwieldy oxen give place to relays of swift horses." "The Emperor," exclaimed the one who had last spoken, in tones of undisguised contempt towards Tan Young, "is the eye of the unapproachable sovereign less than that of a city mandarin, that having failed to come near the one we should now strive to reach the other? Or are we, peradventure, to fill the sleeves of our messenger with gold and his inner script with sapphires?" Nevertheless, the greater part of those who stood around zealously supported Tan Young, crying aloud, "The Emperor! The suggestion is inspired. undoubtedly the beneficent Qualcomm will uphold our cause, and our troubles may now be considered as almost at an end." "Yet," interposed a faltering voice, "who among us is to go?" At the mention of this necessary detail of the plan, the cries which were the loudest raised in exultation suddenly leapt back upon themselves, as each person looked in turn at all the others, and then at himself. The one who had urged the opportune but disconcerting point was lacking in the power of movement in his lower limbs, and progressed at a pace little advanced to that of a shell cow upon 2 slabs of wood. Tan Yung was subject to a disorder which, without any warning, cast him to the ground, almost daily in a condition of writhing frenzy. The one who had opposed him was paralyzed in all but his head and feet, while those who stood about were either blind, lame, camel-backed, leprous, armless, misshapen, or in some way mentally or bodily deficient in an insuperable degree. "Alas!" exclaimed one, as the true understanding of their deformities possessed him, "not only would they of the court receive it as a most detestable insult if we sent such as ourselves, but the probability of anyone so harassed overcoming the difficulties of river, desert, and mountain barrier is so remote that this person is more than willing to stake his entire share of the anticipated bounty against a span length of succulent lotus root or an embossed coffin handle. Let unworthy despair fade," suddenly exclaimed Tan Yung, who nevertheless had been more downcast than any other a moment before. "For among us has been retained one who has probably been especially destined for this very service. There is yet Tin Te. Let us seek him out." With this design they sought for Tin Te, and finding him in his hut, they confidently invoked his assistance, pointing out how he would save all their lives and receive great honor. To their dismay, Tin Te received them with solemn curses and drove them from his door with blows, calling them traitors, ungrateful ones, and rebellious subjects whose minds were so far removed from submissive loyalty that rather than perish harmlessly, they would inopportunely thrust themselves in upon the attention of the divine emperor, when his mind was full of great matters and his thoughts tenaciously fixed upon the abandoned outer lands of his forefathers. "Behold," he cried, "when a hand is raised to sweep into oblivion 1,000 earthworms, they lift no voice in protest, and in this matter ye are less than earthworms. The dogs are content to starve dumbly while their masters feast, and ye are less than dogs. The dutiful son cheerfully submits himself to torture on the chance that his father's sufferings may be lessened, and the emperor, as the supreme head, is more to be venerated than any father, but your hearts are sheathed in avarice and greed." Thus he drove them away, and their last hope being gone, they wandered back to the forest, wailing and filling the air with their despairing moans. For the brief light that had inspired them was extinguished, and the thought that by a patient endurance they might spare the emperor an unnecessary pang was not a sufficient recompense in their eyes. The time of warmth and green life passed. With winter came floods and snowstorms, great tempests from the north, and bitter winds that cut men down as though they had been smitten by the sword. The rivers and lagoons were frozen over. The meager sustenance of the earth lay hidden beneath an impenetrable crust of snow and ice, until those who had hitherto found it a desperate chance to live from day to day now abandoned the unequal struggle for the more attractive certainty of a swift and painless death. One by one the fires went out in the houses of the dead. The ever-increasing snow broke down the walls. Wild beasts from the mountains walked openly about the deserted streets, thrust themselves through such doors as were closed against them, and lurked by night in the most sacred recesses of the ruined temples. The strong and the wealthy had long since fled, and presently out of all the 11 villages of the valley but one man remained alive, and Tin Te lay upon the floor of his inner chamber, dying. There was a sign in the past that more was yet to be accomplished, ran the one thought of his mind as he lay there helpless, his last grain consumed, and the ashes on his hearthstone black. Can it be that so solemn an omen has fallen unfulfilled to the ground? Or has this person long walked hand in hand with shadows in the middle air? Dwellers of Yin, dwellers of Chongnyo, of Wei, Shanta, Feng, the rock of the bleak pagoda, and all the 11 villages of the valley, cried a voice from without. Ho, inhospitable sleeping ones, I have reached the last dwelling of the plain, and no one has as yet bidden me enter, no voice invited me to unlace my sandals and partake of tea. Do they fear that this person is a robber in disguise, or is this the courtesy of the upper Sang Valley? They sleep more deeply, said Tente, speaking back to the full extent of his failing power. Perchance your voice was not raised high enough, O estimable wayfarer. Nevertheless, whether you come in peace or armed with violence, enter here, for the one who lies within is past help and beyond injury. Upon this invitation the stranger entered and stood before Tente. He was of a fierce and martial aspect, carrying a sword at his belt and a bow and arrow slung across his back, but privation had set a deep mark upon his features, and his body bore unmistakable traces of a long and arduous march. His garments were ragged, his limbs torn by rocks and thorny undergrowth, while his ears had fallen away before the rigor of the ice-laden blasts. In his right hand he carried a staff upon which he leaned at every step, and glancing to the ground, Tev perceived that the lower part of his sandals were worn away so that he trod painfully upon his bruised and naked feet. Greeting, said Tenti, when they had regarded each other for a moment, yet alas, no more substantial than of the lips, for the hospitality of the 11 villages is shrunk to what you see before you, and he waved his arm feebly towards the empty bowl and the blackened hearth. Whence come you? From the outer land of Nkau, replied the other, over the Kangling Mountains. It is a moon-to-moon journey, said Tente. Few travelers have ever reached the valley by that inaccessible track. More may come before the snow has melted, replied the stranger with a stress of significance. Less than 7 days ago this person stood upon the northern plains. Tinte raised himself upon his arm. There existed, many cycles ago, a path of a single foot's width, it is said along the edge of the pass called the Ram's Horn, but it has been lost beyond the memory of man. It has been found again, said the stranger, and Kahia and his horde of kins, joined by the vengeance-breathing Fashi, lie encamped less than a short march beyond the pass. It can matter little, said Tente, trembling but speaking to reassure himself. The people are at peace among themselves, the capital adequately defended, and an army sufficiently large to meet any invasion can march out and engage the enemy at a spot most convenient to ourselves. A few days hence, when all preparation is made, continued the stranger, a cloud of armed men will suddenly appear openly, menacing the western boundaries. The capital and the fortified places will be denuded, and all who are available will march out to meet them. They will be but as an empty shell designed to serve a crafty purpose, for in the meanwhile Kahia will creep unsuspected through the Kanglings by the Ram's Horn, and before the army can be recalled, he will swiftly fall upon the defenseless capital and possess it. Alas, exclaimed Tente, why has the end tarried thus long, if it be but for this person's ears to carry to the grave so tormenting a message? Yet how comes it, O stranger, that having been admitted to Kahia's innermost council, you now betray his trust, or how can reliance be placed upon the word of one so treacherous? Touching the reason, replied the stranger, with no appearance of resentment, that is a matter which must one day lie between Kahia, this person, and one long since passed beyond, and to this end have I uncomplainingly striven for the greater part of a lifetime. For the rest, men do not cross the Kinglangs in midwinter, wearing away their lives upon those stormy heights, to make a jest of empty words. Already sinking into the underworld, even as I am now powerless to raise myself above the ground, I, now Cao, swear and attest what I have spoken. Yet, alas, exclaimed Tente, striking his breast bitterly in his dejection, To what end is it that you have journeyed? Know that out of all the 11 villages by famine and pestilence, not another man remains. Beyond the valley stretch the uninhabited sand plains, so that between here and the capital not a solitary dweller could be found to bear the message. The silent one laughs, replied Nao Kao dispassionately, and drawing his cloak more closely about him, he would have composed himself into a reverent attitude to pass beyond. Not so, cried Tin Te, rising in his inspired purpose and standing upright despite the fever that possessed him. The jewel is precious beyond comparison, and the casket mean and falling to pieces, but there is none other. This person will bear the warning. The stranger looked up from the ground in an increasing wonder. You do but dream, old man, he said in a compassionate voice. Before me stands one of trembling limbs and infirm appearance. His face is the color of potter's clay, his eyes sunken and yellow. His bones protrude everywhere like the points of armor, while his garment is scarcely fitted to afford protection against a summer breeze. Such dreams do not fade with the light, replied Tin Te resolutely. His feet are whole and untired, his mind clear. His heart is as inflexibly fixed as the decrees of destiny, and above all, his purpose is one which may reasonably demand divine encouragement. Yet there are the Han Sing Mountains, flung as an insurmountable barrier across the way, said Nao Kao. The wind passes over them, replied Tin Te, binding on his sandals. The girdle, continued the other, thereby indicating the formidable obstacle presented by the tempestuous river, swollen by the mountain snows. The fish, moved by no great purpose, swim from bank to bank, again replied Tin Te. Tell me rather, for the time presses when such issues hang on the lips of dying men, to what extent Kahia's legions stretch. In number, replied Nao Kao, closing his eyes, they are as the stars on a very clear night, when the thousands in front do but serve to conceal the innumerable throng behind. Yet even a small and resolute army taking up its stand secretly in this valley, and falling upon them unexpectedly when half were crossed, could throw them into disorder and rout, and utterly destroy the power of Kaya for all time. So shall it be, said Tin Te from the door. Pass upward with a tranquil mind, O stranger from the outer land. The torch which you have borne so far will not fail until his pyre is lit. Stay but a moment, cried Nao Hao. This person, full of vigor and resource, needed the spur of a most poignant hate to urge his trailing footsteps. Have you, O decrepit one, any such incentive to your failing powers? A mightier one, came back the voice of Tin Te across the snow from afar. Fear not. It is well, they are the great twin brothers, exclaimed Nao Kaiyu. Kaiyu was doomed. Then twice beating the ground with his open hand, he loosened his spirit and passed contentedly into the upper air. The last servant, the wise and accomplished Emperor Ku Kam, to whom later historians have justly given the title Profound, sat upon his agate throne in the Hall of Audience. Around him were gathered the most illustrious from every province of the empire, while emissaries from the courts of other rulers throughout the world passed in procession before him, prostrating themselves in token of the dependence which their sovereigns confessed, and imploring his tolerant acceptance of the priceless gifts they brought. Along the wall stood musicians and singers who filled the air with melodious visions, while fan-bearing slaves dexterously wafted perfumed breezes into every group. So unparalleled was the splendor of the scene that rare embroidered silks were trodden underfoot, and a great fountain was composed of diamonds dropping into a jade basin full of pearls. But Kwo Kam outshone all else by the dignity of his air and the magnificence of his apparel. Suddenly, and without any of the heralding strains of drums and cymbals by which persons of distinction had been announced, the arras before the chief door was plucked aside, and a figure, blinded by so much jeweled brilliance, stumbled into the chamber, still holding thrust out before him the engraved ring bearing the imperial emblem which alone had enabled him to pass the keepers of the outer gates alive. He had the appearance of being a very aged man, for his hair was white and scanty, his face deep with shadows and lined like a riverbank when the waters have receded. And as he advanced, bent down with infirmity, he mumbled certain words in ceaseless repetition. From his feet and garment there fell a sprinkling of sand as he moved, and blood dropped to the floor from many an unhealed wound, but his eyes were very bright, and though sword handles were grasped on all sides at the sight of so presumptuous an intrusion, yet none opposed him. Rather, they fell back, leaving an open passage to the foot of the throne, so that when the emperor lifted his eyes, he saw the aged man moving slowly forward to do obeisance. "Tante, revered father," exclaimed Kulkam, and without pausing a moment, he leapt down from off his throne, thrust aside those who stood about him, and casting his own outer robe of state about Tente's shoulders, embraced him affectionately. "Supreme ruler," murmured Tente, speaking for the emperor's ear alone, and in such a tone of voice as of one who has taught himself a lesson which remains after all other consciousness has passed away. "An army swiftly to the north. Let them dispose themselves about the 11 villages, and, overlooking the invaders, as they assemble, strike when they are sufficiently numerous for the victory to be lasting and decisive. The passage of the ram's horn has been found, and the malignant Fuchi, banded in an unnatural alliance with the barbarian Kins, lies with itching feet beyond the Kanglings. The invasion threatening on the west is but a snare. Let a single camp, feigning to be a multitudinous legion, be thrown against it. Suffer delay from no cause. Weigh no alternative. He who speaks is Tente, at whose assuring word the youth Hong was wont to cast himself into the deepest waters fearlessly. His eyes are no less clear today, but his heart is made small with overwhelming deference, or an unshrinking loyalty. He would cry, 'Hear and obey!' All flags, iron caps, tigers, braves, all to the Seng Valley, leaving behind them the swallow in their march, and moving with the guile and secrecy of the ring tree snake." With these words, Tente's endurance passed its drawn-out limit, and again repeating in a clear and decisive voice, all to the north," he released his joints and would have fallen to the ground had it not been for the emperor's restraining arms. When Tente again returned to a knowledge of the lower world, he was seated upon the throne to which the emperor had borne him. His rest had been made easy by the luxurious cloaks of the courtiers and emissaries which had been lavishly heaped about him, while during his trance the truly high-minded Qualcomm had not disdained to wash his feet in a golden basin of perfumed water, to shave his limbs, and to anoint his head. The greater part of the assembly had been dismissed, but some of the most trusted among the ministers and officials still waited in attendance about the door. "Great and enlightened one," said Tente, as soon as his stupor was lifted, "has this person delivered his message competently?" For his mind was still a seared vision of snow and sand, and perchance his tongue has stumbled. "Bend your ears to the wall, O my father," replied the emperor, "and be assured." A radiance of the fullest satisfaction lifted the settling shadows for a moment from Tente's countenance, as from the outer court came at intervals the low and guarded words of command, the orderly clashing of weapons as they fell into their appointed places, and the regular and unceasing tread of armed men marching forth. "To the Seng Valley, by no chance to the west?" he demanded, trembling between anxiety and hope, and drinking in the sound of the rhythmic tramp which to his ears possessed a more alluring charm than if it were the melody of blind singing girls. "Even to the 11 villages," replied the emperor, "at your unquestioned word, though my kingdom should hang upon the outcome." "It is sufficient to have lived so long," said Tente. Then perceiving that it was evening, for the jade and crystal lamps were lighted, he cried out, "The time has leapt unnoted. How many are by this hour upon the march?" "60 companies of 100 spearmen each," said Qualcomm. "By dawn, 4 times that number will be on their way." In less than 3 days, a like force will be disposed about the passes of the Hansing Mountains and the river fords, while at the same time the guards from less important towns will have been withdrawn to take their place upon the city walls. Such words are more melodious than the sound of many marble lutes, said Tente, sinking back as though in repose. Now is mine that peace spoken of by the philosopher Chi as the greatest, the eye closing upon its accomplished work. Assuredly do you stand in need of the healing sleep of nature, said the emperor, not grasping the inner significance of the words. Now that you are somewhat rested, esteemed sire, suffer this one to show you the various apartments of the palace, so that you may select for your own such as most pleasingly attract your notice. Yet a little longer, entreated Tente. A little longer by your side and listening to your voice alone, if it may be permitted, O sublime one. It is for my father to command, replied Quilcom. Perchance they of the 11 villages sent some special message of gratifying loyalty which you would relate without delay. They slept, omnipotence, or without doubt it would be so, replied Tenti. Truly, agreed the emperor. It was night when you set forth, my father. The shadows had fallen deeply upon the Upper Sang Valley, said Tente evasively. The keeper of the imperial stores has frequently conveyed to us their expressions of unfeigned gratitude for the bounty by which we have sought to keep alive the memory of their hospitality and our own indebtedness, said the emperor. The sympathetic person cannot have overstated their words, replied Tente falteringly. Never, as their own utterances bear testimony, never was food more welcome, fuel more eagerly sought for, and clothing more necessary than in the years of the most recent past. The assurance is as dew upon the drooping lotus, said Quocum with a lightening countenance. To maintain the people in an unshaken prosperity, to frown heavily upon extortion, and to establish justice throughout the land, these have been the achievements of the years of peace. Yet often, O my father, this one's mind has turned yearningly to the happier absence of strife and the simple abundance which you and they of the valley know. The deities ordain, and the balance weighs. Your reward will be the greater, replied Tente. Already he spoke with difficulty, and his eyes were fast closing, but he held himself rigidly, well knowing that his spirit must still obey his will. Do you not crave now to partake of food and wine? Inquired the emperor with tender solicitude. A feast has long been prepared of the choicest dishes in your honor. Consider well the fatigue through which you have passed. It has faded, replied Tinte, in a voice scarcely above a whisper. The earthly body has ceased to sway the mind. A little longer, restored one, a very brief span of time. Your words are my breath, my father, said the emperor deferentially. Yet there is one matter which we had reserved for affectionate censure. It would have spared the feet of one who is foremost in our concern, if you had been content to send the warning by one of the slaves whose acceptance we craved last year, while you followed more leisurely by the chariot and the 8 white horses which we deemed suited to your use. Tente was no longer able to express himself in words, but at this indication of the emperor's unceasing thought, a great happiness shone on his face. What remains must reasonably have been his reflection, or who shall leave the shade of the fruitful palm tree to search for raisins? Therefore, having reached so supreme an eminence that there was nothing human above, he relaxed the effort by which he had so long sustained himself, and suffering his spirit to pass unchecked, he at once fell back lifeless among the cushions of the throne, that all who should come after might learn by his example. The history of Tente was inscribed upon 18 tablets of jade, carved patiently and with graceful skill by the most expert stonecutters of the age. A triumphal arch of 7 heights was also erected outside the city and called by his name, but the efforts of storytellers and poets will keep alive the memory of Tente even when these imperishable monuments shall have long fallen from their destined use. When Kai Lung had completed the story of the loyalty of Tente and had pointed out the forgotten splendor of the crumbling arch, the coolness of the evening tempted them to resume their way. Moving without discomfort to themselves before nightfall, they reached a small but seemly cottage conveniently placed upon the mountainside. At the gate stood an aged person whose dignified appearance was greatly added to by his long white mustaches. These possessions he pointed out to Huame with inoffensive pride as he welcomed the two who stood before him. "Venerated father," explained Kai Lung dutifully, "this is she who has been destined from the beginning of time to raise up 100 sons to keep your line extant." "In that case," remarked the patriarch, "your troubles are only just beginning. As for me, since all that is now arranged, I can see about my own departure. Whatever height the tree, its leaves return to the earth at last. It is thus at evening time tomorrow the light will again shine forth," whispered Kai Lung. "Alas, Radiance, that you who have dwelt about a palace should be brought to so mean a hut. If it is small, your presence will pervade it. In a palace there are many empty rooms," replied Huame with a reassuring glance. "I enter to prepare our evening rice." The end. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey, the characters, and the world they carried with them. If you enjoyed this audiobook, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Your support helps keep these stories alive and allows more timeless books to be shared with listeners around the world. Until next time, thank you for listening.